All right, up next we have Eric. Eric wrote in and said, I engage in conversations with people with different beliefs/views/opinions on a fairly regular basis, although not nearly as much as Stefan. My dad, for example, believes that some government involvement in the free market is necessary, and he always uses Rockefeller as an example of a greedy robber baron who uses underhanded tactics to eliminate his competitors without the aid of government. I still can't seem to be able to explain to him how government intervention is bad, even though it seems like such an obvious, simple matter to me. That's from Eric, and I thought it would be fun to do a role play where he played the role of his dad or other people with arguments, and Steph could try and poke holes in them. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Hey, Eric, how you doing?
All right.
Now, I did consent to this role play, but I thought that Mike told me I was going to play Christian Grey from 50 Shades of Grey, so I'm going to need to change some of the backdrop and equipment in the show. It's just going to be verbal sparring, so I just wanted to get you up to speed on that.
Steph, do you just want a helicopter? Is that what you're telling me?
Oh! All right.
Completely went over my head.
As helicopters generally do. So, Eric, do you want to play your dad and I'll play you or someone who's not your dad?
Yeah, I'll try. It's not always easy for me to I don't know, because it's not always easy for me to really understand the argument. If I'm playing devil's advocate, understanding the argument on the other hand, because I'm the one that's arguing against it most of the time.
I know.
Basically.
But you're not arguing against it successfully, which is why I'm going to sort of say, like, if your golf swing keeps going awry, I'm going to reach around your hips and I'm going to help you fix your swing, right? So,
right. Now, basically, the argument is, like, for example, with the example with Rockefeller,
we know. Sorry, I hate to interrupt you when you're just nodding, but. We know, everybody knows, like everybody who's interested in this topic knows about the sort of greedy robber baron and so on. And these guys were just riding roughshod over the population and they were squeezing out competitors with using unjust and wrong methods, all within the free market. And the desperate consumers who were being ground into nutmeg under the giant stone wheels of their monopolies had to reach out and cry out for the government to bring in the Sherman Antitrust Act so that these companies could be broken up and there could be some space for the free market to operate. Because we all know that particular story, right?
Right.
So your father would say something like that, right? And
Go ahead.
A
little more specific though, is he would specifically talk about Rockefeller building a gas station or something similar to that next to another one, undercharge the prices, drive the other one out of business, and then when they go out of business, jack the price up higher than what the other one's was.
Okay, so he would say something like that, right? No, he would say something like that
over and over again until he was the.
So I would say that. I would say, look, if there was a possibility that Rockefeller was a very successful businessman, not a corrupt guy who, like Mr. Burns style, just, was a creepy guy with spots and no discernible business expertise who mysteriously owned a nuclear power plant, but if he was a very good businessman and if he was legitimately out-competing the competition, like if he was efficient, if he was cost-effective, if he was innovative, if he had very different business methods that were more successful than his competitors, is it understandable that his competitors would not like him?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, we're just theorizing here. Now, if his competitors were the ones who wrote the history of Rockefeller, do you think that they would write negatively about him?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they would.
If the government wanted to have power over the market, would it accept the arguments of his competitors that Rockefeller was just some mean, bad guy in order to pursue their goal of having more and more power over the economy? And of course, if they offered to take care of Rockefeller to his competitors, then those competitors would give those politicians lots of donations and lots of positive press and lots of good things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so that these are all possibilities, and I haven't proven anything yet. I'm just looking at a possibility. And I would say, Dad, would you be surprised to learn that the person who wrote the most popular work on Rockefeller was the brother of the treasurer of the Pure Oil Company, which was being put out of business by Rockefeller's Standard Oil's prices. In other words, that the person who wrote the most about Rockefeller, and coincidentally the most negatively about Rockefeller, had a direct conflict of interest in that Rockefeller was putting her brother out of business and his entire company. Massive millions of dollars of family wealth was bound up in all of this.
Huh. I wasn't actually aware of that one.
Yeah, so you want to look up the journalist Ida Tarbell, Idatarbell. Her brother was the treasurer of the Pure Oil Company, could not compete with Standard Oil's low prices.
Real quick, could you spell that again?
Sure. Ida. Tarbell. She wrote article after article lambasting him as a robber baron and calling for government action, and she wrote an entire book about the guy, lambasting stuff, blah, 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 right? Now, another thing that I would say about Rockefeller is if he was a robber baron, then clearly he was not innovative in business. Like, you can't really be both. You can't just, like a robber baron, you can't just be horribly predatory and use your power in evil intent and also be very innovative in business and very efficient in business, right?
Right. Well, I think my dad would argue that it's because he owned the land that the oil came from, and you don't need to be very innovative in order to just mine oil.
All right, okay. So, in other words, if Rockefeller was innovative, then that would be an argument against him being a robber baron.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Well,
no, it would. It would. If he said you don't need any intelligence to drill for oil, or you don't need to be innovative to accumulate that amount of wealth, then if Rockefeller was innovative in the business world, then that would undermine the argument that he was just some robber baron, right?
I don't know if that would undermine the idea in my dad's mind.
No, I understand that. But if your dad made the case that you don't need much innovation to get rich through oil, then if Rockefeller, well, first of all, Rockefeller didn't primarily become rich through oil. That's sort of misunderstanding. So let's just do a quick 411 of the guy, right? Rockefeller, guy came from a dirt poor background. His father was a peddler, like wandering street to street selling buttons and crap, right? Barely made any money. Guy was born in 1839. You can get some more of this stuff from Mises.org. He was one of 6 kids. His first job when he graduated from high school at the age of 16, he was an assistant bookkeeper. Do you know how much he made a day as an assistant bookkeeper?
I wouldn't begin to be able to guess. Probably a very, very tiny amount.
How much do you think it would be in today's dollars?
Probably less than minimum wage would be my guess.
Less than $10 a day or so. So at the time, it was 15 cents a day he was making. But he worked very hard, and he was a mad bastard for saving money. So he started as an assistant bookkeeper. He was good at sales. So by 23, he had saved up $4,000. That's a hardworking, big saving guy, right?
Yep.
So he invested this $4,000 in an oil refinery. Now listen, $4,000 back in the day, that's a staggering amount of money for a young man. A lot of guys would be like, hey, I'm going to pull a Justin Trudeau and travel 4,000 different countries so that I can learn that there's no such thing as values. So he took this money at the age of 23, didn't get married, didn't go party, didn't drink, didn't travel. He invested it in an oil refinery. And there was a lot of innovation. So he would actually go and work the physical labor jobs of his employees to make sure that he understood how to be as efficient as humanly possible. So this is a little quote from an economist who wrote about the guy, Dominic Armentano. So the firm was originally Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler, and it later became Standard Oil, which still lives on in the acronym Esso, right? Esso, the gas station, was originally SO, Standard Oil. So the economist wrote that Standard Oil, quote, prospered quickly in the intensely competitive industry due to the economic excellence of its entire operations. Instead of buying oil from jobbers, they made the jobbers profit by sending their own purchasing men into the oil region. They also made their own sulfuric acid and barrels, lumber, wagons, and glue. They kept minute and accurate records of every item from rivets to barrel bungs. They built elaborate storage facilities near their refineries. Rockefeller bargained as shrewdly for crude oil as anyone has before or since. And Sam Andrews coaxed more kerosene from a barrel of crude than the competition could. In addition, the Rockefeller firm put out the cleanest burning kerosene and managed to profitably dispose of most of the residues in the form of lubricating oil, paraffin wax, and Vaseline. So two things, it's not the only two things, but two things that Rockefeller and his company did is, number one, what's called vertical integration, right? So to produce stuff, let's say to produce all of this stuff, they needed a bunch of coal, right? So what you do, if you, before Rockefeller, what most people did was they said to some coal company, okay, we need 3 years of coal from you. Here's the price that we're going to go with. Now, at some point, that price may vary. It may go up. It may go down. If it goes down, they're going to want to renegotiate for you to pay them, well, a different amount, right? If it goes up, they want variable interest rates. They want to go up and down. But you sign something so you can plan ahead. We're going to pay you X amount of dollars for the next 3 years. Now, if the coal, again, it will change in price, and maybe they'll abide by the agreement and maybe they won't. Maybe the coal company goes out of business. Maybe there's a big fire. Maybe it's some big problem, right? And so what Rockefeller and his company did was they did what's called vertical integration. So instead of saying, well, someone's going to make our barrels, someone's going to produce our coal, someone's going to make our wagons, someone's going to even build the company store, they did it all themselves. Now, there are pluses and minuses. You don't get as much specialization, but you get a much more reliable system. And so you can really monitor the quality of your own inputs. You're not going to ship substandard oil to yourself. You're not going to ship substandard coal to yourself. You're not going to use substandard wood in the building of your factories and so on. And so you get high quality stuff. You don't get as much variability in price, right? So just buy the coal mine, buy the coal plant or whatever it is, and you're all set. So that's number one. This is very innovative. Number two was the oil industry is incredibly wasteful, or at least it was before Rockefeller, right? So you'd make the oil and you'd make the refined oil or the crude oil and you'd end up with all this crap. But they figured out how to turn this leftover crap into stuff like lubricating oil, paraffin wax, Vaseline, paint, varnish, and other things. In fact, in Rockefeller's company, the waste that was left over from the production of oil was turned into 300 different products. Now, that's huge, because if you can't find a use for that stuff, you've got to pay to dispose of it. Now, of course, this is before environmental regulations and so on, but you still had to pay to get rid of it, and you couldn't make money from it. I mean, you can't just dump it on the factory floor. You have to ship it out somewhere and find some place to house it or put it. And so the fact what they were able to make 300 products and make money from the waste that other people had to pay to dispose was enormously valuable. Now, one of the things that's so important is that, like, you build an oil refinery, right? And you spend, I don't know, $50 million to build your oil refinery. Now, the more customers you add, the cheaper it is per customer to produce the oil, right? So from 1869, the Rockefeller Company cut its cost of refining a gallon of oil from 3 cents in 1869 to less than half a cent by 1885. So that's astonishing. I mean, that's incredible. That's like 1/6 of the price in 16 years. It's incredible. Now, if Rockefeller was some robber baron, then he would have kept all of that money for himself, but he didn't. He passed a lot of these savings along to the consumer. The price of refined oil from 1869 was more than 30 cents a gallon and went down to 18 cents. Went down to 8 cents by 1885. So that, again, is very, very significant. So he's got vertical integration going. He's getting all the waste products turned into profitable things that he can sell. And he's reducing the cost of producing oil enormously. And he passes those savings along to the consumer. Now, you can't just turn around and say, I'm going to imitate that. I'm going to just go and do all the vertical integration. This stuff takes a long time to set up and takes a lot of skill to manage. Now, another thing that really annoyed his competitors was that shipping oil, I mean, you basically had to use rail to ship oil. And because he had such an enormous volume, the railroad companies gave him a huge discount. Because it's just easier, one person to build, you can get a whole train full of the stuff, only one place to stop, not a lot of different pickups and drop-offs, right? Like, I mean, if you're UPS, you want to take 100 packages from one place than one package from 100 different places. You can give a much better deal to the guy who's going to send 100 packages from one place. And so, because Rockefeller was producing so much, he got incredible deals from the railroad industry. Now, the railroad industry, Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the guys in the railroad industry. He said, listen, if you give me the same volume of business that Rockefeller does, I'll give you exactly the same deal. But because nobody produced or was as efficient as Rockefeller, no one could do it. So everyone else had to pay more and pay more and pay more. And what he did was he was so good at making kerosene, which is, I guess, one of the byproducts of the oil industry, that in the 1870s, Rockefeller facilitated the replacement of whale oil by kerosene, right? This is the primary source for light in America, right? You know, there's little wicks, and there's I used to use these when I worked up north sometimes. You got these little oil flasks, these wicks that go up and you light them off. It's huge. It's huge. So in fact, Rockefeller saved the whales because the whales were being decimated because of everyone's thirst for whale oil. And this was huge. Whale oil was so expensive relative to kerosene that when kerosene replaced whale oil, it meant that you could actually do things after dark, like work, and you could read and so on. And this was very big. It actually exploded literacy rates and helped the spread of books and libraries in the 1870s. And Rockefeller was very generous with his employees. He paid them significantly more than the competition did. Why? Because he wanted the best. And so he almost never had any strikes or labor disputes. And if his managers came up with good ideas for making things more efficient or reducing the cost of things, he would give them big bonuses and paid time off as making an incentive for them to do all of this. So this was all very innovative stuff. A lot of this is kind of taken for granted now, but this was very, very innovative. And the one thing that this woman, who was the brother of the treasurer of a competing oil industry, stood to lose their family fortune, I'm guessing, if Rockefeller succeeded. The one thing that she popularized, which is what your dad would refer to in this conversation, the one thing she popularized was, tell me if this makes sense, is this idea that, you see, Rockefeller had so much money that he could artificially lower the cost of what he was selling to the point where all of his competitors were driven out of business, and then he could jack up the prices enormously after they were driven out of business, right?
Yep, that's exactly what he said.
Yeah, economists don't believe this at all. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. This idea of predatory pricing and so on, no empirical validity. It has never, ever been demonstrated in the entire history of economics that a monopoly has ever been created in that way. And it was never a tactic that was used by Standard Oil, which was never a monopoly anyway. Now, the most they got was in the mid 80% dominance of the industry, which is huge, right? But I mean, that was Microsoft with PCs relative to Apple and all. So they got into the mid 80s. Now, by the time the government started investigating them for supposedly being a monopoly, I mean, his business practices had spread throughout the industry and so on. So he was losing market share enormously. So from the mid 80s, he'd gone down to only the mid 60s in terms of his dominance of the oil industry. And so whatever monopoly there was, because he was kind of first to market with these innovations, they were then copied. I mean, you can't patent vertical integration or anything like that. So he was already losing whatever supposed monopoly he had, which is relatively temporary because he was so innovative. So the market was solving it already when the government came trundling along. And so, regarding this, and I've heard this a million times, well, you have so much money, you're going to lower your prices, drive everyone out of business, then jack this stuff up. That is, it doesn't take a lot of thought. And this is sort of my concern about your dad and this sort of propaganda, right?
Right.
It doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that this is a very, very risky business strategy, right? Because if you're going to, if you're dominant in the market to the point where you supposedly have all of this magic money, let's say you have 80% or 80, I think they had a high of 88% or so in 1890, and then it went down to 64% by 1911. So if you're selling 88% of the oil and then you sell below market price to, quote, drive out competitors, you are losing a crap ton of money because you're selling the most oil. So if you're selling below market, you're losing, like in real terms, more money than your competitors, right? And how long is this supposed to take? How long does it take to drive other people out of business? See, if you're a competitor to somebody who's selling below market to drive you out of business, you can say that to your investors. Listen, Rockefeller's crazy. He's losing, X amount of money on every barrel of oil he sells. He can't keep it up forever. We just have to hang tight. He's destroying his capital reserves. He's going to have less money for R&D, less money for expansion, less money for improvement, less money to pay quality employees. We're going to be able to poach them very easily. All you have to do is give us some money and wait for him to self-destruct. Because how long does it take to drive all of your competitors out of business by undercutting them? Is it a decade? Is it 20 years? Maybe.
Well,
maybe for some profit down the road. Because let's say you do drive a bunch of people out of business because you're willing to lose money for 20 years or whatever. What about people overseas? They can ship oil to your. What about Canada? What about Mexico? They can ship oil, and what can you do about it? I mean, so it doesn't work. There's no history of it working. Standard Oil never did it, and there's no example that I'm aware of in economics that says this ever works. It was a story told by the sister of the guy who was going to lose millions if Rockefeller succeeded, but it's not a valid concept in economics.
Well, I guess most people that believe this sort of thing believe that it takes a lot longer than 10 years, probably a year or less, to drive somebody out of business using those tactics. But I guess in order for that to work, they'd have to be, the business that would be, or the businesses that would lose out would have to be, would have to have tiny, tiny profit margins for them to go under that quickly.
Right. And you would be losing more money than them. If you've got 88% of the market and you're selling way below cost, and why would you? You've already got 88% of the market. Why would you want to risk that in order to get another couple of percentage points?
Right. Well, they would argue that that's how he got 88% to begin with.
Except it's not, because there's no evidence that he ever sold below cost. There's no evidence that he ever sold below cost. Now, he sold below his competitors' cost. Now, those competitors, like the people who were losing out to this guy, I mean, good Lord. I mean, think of the Democrats last November, right? They had a 30-year experienced politician lose out to a guy who'd never run for office before. Now, did they say, wow, we really misread things, we really misjudged things, we must be so out of touch with the American population, we better rejig things and fire things up again and maybe get some people, some changes at the top of the... No, what did they do? The Russians hacked the election. They didn't tell the truth about why they lost. They made up all this conspiracy theories. Now, if you're a losing company, if you're the head of a losing company, a company that's losing out to Rockefeller, to Standard Oil, are you going to go to your shareholders and say, I'm incompetent, I'm an idiot, I'm not doing all the stuff that Rockefeller's doing, you should sell my shares and go and buy his shares, or you should at least fire me, for heaven's sakes, and maybe sue me for fiduciary misconduct for not doing obvious things to protect the value of your investment. No, he's not going to go to there. He's going to pull a Democrat party and he's going to blame everyone but himself. And, they're undercutting us. They've got this war chest. The reason why they're able to charge less than us is because they're selling at a loss, but they're not telling anyone. That's the kind of bullshit you're going to make up, right? You're not going to say, well, the reason he can sell less than us is because while I was courting all these people in Washington and I was having wonderful quail shoots in the marshes, and I was going on sail around the world trips with all of your shareholder money, while I was doing all this crap, he was figuring out how to turn whale oil into cell phones, or I don't know how to turn waste byproducts into Russian brides or something, right?
Right. Oh, real quick, by the way, the coal that you'd mentioned earlier, that was also that is also very frequently given as an example of monopolies that existed without the intervention of government.
But what do they mean by monopolies? If
monopolies.
No, but sorry. What I mean is, if it is a monopoly because everyone else is selling oil for 2 cents, but he's selling it for half a cent, so everybody wants to buy from him, is that a monopoly? What does that even mean?
Well, in this particular sense, it's not necessarily that one, for example, one coal mine has a monopoly and sells to everybody in that sense. It's more that they have a monopoly on employees, where if you live in this town, for example, you've got really not much choice but to work for the coal mine. You don't have much of a choice. You don't have a choice to move somewhere else and get another job per se. They've got like, for example, the song, St. Peter, don't you call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store, because the coal mines, well, at least this is what we're told, would basically be self-sufficient for the company, but they would provide everything to their employees, like, for example, food, clothing and such, but they'd still have to pay for everything. So they had to get but they had a monopoly on all of that, so they had to get their livelihood, or their everyday needs, through the company that they worked for.
Sure. No, I get it. If you go to an all-inclusive resort, or you go to a resort not an all-inclusive, if you go to some resort and it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, you kind of have to eat at their restaurants, right? Right. They have a monopoly on food. Those evil robber baron bastards with tanning oil. Right. So what? So I don't understand. I mean, why not? I mean, you can open up a competing store, indebted. Right?
Well, supposedly these people would become indebted to the company, so that they couldn't, like, for example, the line in the song that says, I owe my soul to the company store,
I don't know if we want to base economic theories on folk songs written by communists.
Right.
Right. I mean, come on.
Right, but of course but that's where the song supposedly came from.
Yeah, but look, I mean, if let's just, sorry to interrupt, but let's say there's some town, right? The town of Bobsville. Right. And Bobsville has a big mine, and the store is the company store, right?
Right.
Okay. So if the store is selling stuff for too high a price, then you can just take your home, convert it into a store, and sell stuff for cheaper.
Assuming that you can get the supplies that the company can get.
What do you mean? There's a mail service. What do you mean if you can get the supplies? I mean, you can go and get them. You wheel them in. You can hire people to bring them in.
Assuming that you can do it at the same price that the company can.
Okay, but if you can't, then the company's not ripping anyone off. If you can't sell it for cheaper than the company can, then the company's selling it as cheap as it can be sold.
Right. I guess the argument at that point becomes, well, they're still not paying their employees enough to even be able to pay the cheap prices.
Well, if they're not paying their employees enough to live, then the employees need to go start a store and sell it for cheaper. And if they can't, then it's not an economically viable mine. And therefore, people need to not be at the place where that mine is. They got to move somewhere. They got to go somewhere. This happens all the time. Mines get exhausted and everyone moves away and they move someplace new. You've seen all of these creepy ghost towns of like old mining towns that nobody's lived in for 50 years or 100 years. So if you can't make it economically viable, then you go somewhere else, right?
Right.
Now, it couldn't be that there were alcoholics who drank themselves dry, like who drank the entire store dry and ended up with a bill that they were shocked and appalled about and blamed the company for their own alcoholism, right? That could never possibly. I'm going to write a song about the company store, rip me off. It's like, I don't know. I'd like to see some of the numbers there. I'd like to see what you bought.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There is a huge population of people in the world.
It's another one of those things that makes me glad that I've never drank.
Yeah. No, there's a huge population of people in the world who blame the nefarious actions of others for their own screw-ups, right?
Right.
You know, how many people in the last recession, like the housing crash of 2007, 2008, where people ended up not being able to pay their bills because they didn't read not even the fine print, but they didn't read or understand the basic principles of variable rate mortgages, right? How many people said, well, I took a lower interest rate with variable rate mortgage. I was aware that there could be a risk, but it's okay because I buffered for that. Or did they just sign some piece of paper when someone said, you get a loan at 2.5%? And then when it went up to 5 or 6 or 7%, they said, man, I got ripped off. The bank is stealing from me and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's happened plenty of times.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
How many times do people say, it wasn't me? Russia stole the election from its folks.
Oh, something I hear on a constant basis, when people have been divorced, or, even if they've, especially if they've been divorced more than once, the fault is never themselves.
Right.
It's always, well, my spouse was terrible to me. He was abusive and it was better that I got out of it. And when you point out, it's like, well, you chose this person to begin with.
Well, no, don't say
And
that.
that. Oh yeah, I've gotten tons of blowback from even suggesting that. It's like, okay, it's not your fault that you got abused, except only to the point where you chose to be with the person that was abusive. And of course they try to say, it's like, well, there's no way that I could have known beforehand.
Yeah.
I don't believe it.
I don't believe it at all.
But,
I mean, I don't believe it at all. People don't hide and camouflage that well.
But I don't know how to explain this either. I'm a little lacking in the rhetorical skills, but
I just find that the cough can be helpful. Bullshit. Something like that. That can be enormously helpful. The other thing, too, is that one of the reasons that the government, I think, didn't like Rockefeller was because Rockefeller, by making kerosene so cheap and allowing people to read into the wee hours, this was a time of great American political activity. There were pamphleteers. There was lots of stuff going on. There was a great sense that America was drifting from the Constitution, especially after the Civil War and so on. And there were lots of people writing. I mean, just think of Lysander Spooner, the Constitution of No Authority. This is great stuff to read about how voting is, largely nonsense. But the population was becoming enormously well educated as the result of Rockefeller's innovations.
Most would say that's probably because most people would say that it's because of the proliferation of public schools.
Right. Yes, of course. Public schools.
I don't buy it either.
Always trying to inculcate a sense of skepticism towards government. Oh yeah, those government schools. Yeah, I'll wait for that for the moment that Coca-Cola puts out an ad showing a penny being cleaned by being dropped in a bottle of Coke or something. I don't know, people's teeth rotting or whatever.
I even mentioned something like, like for example, college. You send an idiot to college, and all you get is an educated idiot. And
well, no, it's more dangerous than that. You get a propagandized idiot, which is far more dangerous.
Well, yeah, that's true.
What's the old thing? You can't make anything foolproof because fools are so ingenious. You can't make anything propaganda-proof because propagandized people are so ingenious.
Right. The response that I had gotten to that was, one of, considerable skepticism. It's like, are you suggesting that educating people doesn't work? And I'm like, well, the way that it's being done, no, it really doesn't.
What do government schools have to do with education? I mean, just because they've got the word school in the title doesn't mean that it's anything to do with education.
Well, I think far too many people rely on the public schools in order to teach their kids how to read and write.
Yeah,
and, they don't, well, most kids who go through public school, sure, they can read and write. They can't do it very well, but they can do it.
My daughter and I were flipping through the curriculum the other day, and she said, why is it all so meaningless? Why would you learn any of this? We were like, here's how you build different types of bridges. And she's like, building a bridge, that's like one of 1,000 jobs you could possibly get. Why would you focus on that? And so I had to sort of explain that when you get multiculturalism, you get all these different value systems. And if you teach any values whatsoever, anything really important about virtue or gods or truth or ethics if you teach anything about the government or anything, then you're going to offend and alienate and upset a whole bunch of people who are going to make your life difficult. Like when I grew up as a kid in England, this is right, I guess after Enoch Powell's speech or during the whole flood of third world immigration that Enoch Powell, you should look the speech up called Rivers of Blood. It's quite powerful. which of course he was naturally condemned for because he was, a slightly toshier or poshier version of Tommy Robinson. But I could have, like, I was taught a lot of nationalist pride in England, you know, where the lamp of human civilization, we brought all these great things to the world. We ended the slave trade. We brought civilization to the darkest corners of the world with the empire. A lot of national pride. You can't have that anymore, right? Because a lot of people are coming from outside of England. And if you teach all this national pride that England is the best, well, what are the kids from Somalia going to think? And what are they going to say to their parents? And their parents are going to get really upset. And you're propagandizing my children. I mean, you can't have any value content. It's either boring or blandly pro-state propaganda. But it's never about values, and it's certainly never about virtue. You can't have any of that in school.
That reminds me. Are you familiar with Evan Sayet?
No.
Oh, Evan Sayet. He was actually a comedian. He was a writer in Hollywood for a while, and he used to be a big government liberal. You know, mostly because he was a New York Jew. You know, it was just kind of how they were. But he gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation, where he explained his conversion from being a liberal to being a conservative. And he gives this explanation as to how the modern liberal thinks. And, you know, all this stuff, the reason that they value multiculturalism so much. I tell you what, it was a real eye-opener for me. Of course, I'm sure if you listened to this speech, you'd probably just hear a lot of the things that you've already discovered or things like that. It's just that at the time when I first heard it, this was a real eye-opener, you know, because I've been a conservative my whole life. I never had that transition period. And, you know, the ideas put forth by liberals just never made any sense to me. It's like, how can you possibly have these conflicting standards? And don't you see how nuts everything that you believe is?
Right. Now, I would also say to your dad, like, I gave a lot of evidence in sort of what I was saying. But remember that if your dad is saying this guy's a robber baron and so on, then he needs to provide proof, right? He's the one making the positive claim. He's the one who needs, the burden of proof is on him. Now, there certainly were people who used the power of the state to stifle competition, right? It's the old argument. It's like, you can either build a better mousetrap or you can have the government suppress all the other mousetrap makers, you know, or at least prevent people from shipping them in from overseas or whatever. And there was a lot of this that went on in the 19th century. Like there were two philosophies or ideas behind building railroads. And lots of people say, oh, the railroads in America, they could never have been built without government subsidies. It's complete nonsense. There was a guy named James Hill, again, from a very, very poor background. The people in the 19th century were amazing. One of the biggest and best engineers in America was blind, legally blind, right before the American with Disabilities Act. Completely blind, not legally, completely blind, and became an engineer. Incredible. And this guy Hill was an incredible railway engineer. Incredible. I mean, he was looking for a pass through the Rockies that was kind of legendary. He paid a guy for months just wander around the Rockies until he found this path, and he was overjoyed because it cut like 100 miles off the route. He was funding it himself. He paid for everything himself, and so he built the very best material, so he never had to rebuild anything. Now, there was another railroad that he was supposed to join up with that was all political bullshit. It was all, they were paid by the mile. And so what they did was they had all these wandering loopy things, right? And then, of course, some mayor would say, hey, man, if you bring the road to if you bring the railroad to my town, have it go past my town, that would be fantastic, you know, and maybe I'll give you a little something for that and all. So they ended up with these ridiculously inefficient, and they used crap materials, like even cottonwood and stuff that just, like, after one winter was totally useless. And they had to rebuild most of it the next year. And so the guy who got all these subsidies, and also they skimmed like crazy. Like the railroad companies got all these subsidies from the government. I mean, they just stole like crazy. Now, if it's your company, what's the point of stealing from your own company? You know, it's like, hey man, I took a stapler home from my own company. it's your stapler either way, right? So he didn't. Hill was not. There was no corruption there. But the guys who were getting all this government money, they just siphoned all that stuff off. The usual $500 hammer stuff that you see going on in the military-industrial complex. And so they say, these railroads could never have been built without subsidies and so on. It's like, well, they were built, and they were built way, way better. And Tom DiLorenzo is great on this stuff but just remember, your dad is the one, he's making a claim this guy was a robber baron. It's like, okay, well, what's your proof? Well, he cut all these prices to drive other people out of business. Like, okay, where's the proof? Rather than somebody said this, where's the actual proof? Otherwise, it's, kind of slander. He was a robber baron. Where's your proof? Where is the actual proof? I mean, there's some guy, some poor, dedicated, probably Aspie bastard, who went through the 11,000 pages of the government's case against Standard Oil as a monopoly. And he went through it all and just said it was all nonsense and it was all political and it was all, So he was a victim of the real robber barons, are the people who use state power, right? Called crony capitalism or crapitalism. The people who use state power. I
tend to call it corporatism.
Corporatism is another way of putting it, although there are honest corporations as well. But it is the people who use political power to get what they want done and to profit through political relationships rather than relationships with customers in the free market. Those are the real robber barons. But the government wants power over business, and bad businessmen want someone else to blame for the losses that their companies are experiencing. And the media, of course, loves to shit on business and has for, since the days of pre-Judas. And so you put all these things together, you're going to end up with a history of 19th century capitalism that is about as accurate as the history of Joseph McCarthy in the 50s. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it just makes me wonder why so many of these big corporate heads are so liberal. I mean, like, for example, you look at Apple, I think Apple's a fine company. I think they make fine products, but their leadership is pretty much all liberals. And it's just, I don't see how you could be, unless you yourself are using the power of the state. Of course, that's kind of how the system is built these days. Unless you yourself are actively using the power of the state to suppress your competition, I don't see what's in it for them to be liberals.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry to be annoying, but that's probably because you don't know all the backdrop to how they make their money. So a couple of things. Apple in particular sells to a younger set, and younger sets tend to be liberal. And so if Apple is out there stumping for liberals, it's more in accordance with the leftist views of their primarily youthful audience. That's sort of number one. Number two is they use the power of the state to gain unfair leverage over their employees through these H-1B visa programs where you're basically tied to your desk, like you're basically a tech serf, right? They get all these people coming from overseas. This came out on Breitbart, I think it was just yesterday or maybe the day before, which is that 330,000 foreign students were hired by American companies, mostly in the STEM fields, right? And of course, they were hired instead of Americans. And why were they hired? Because the government gives big tax breaks and subsidies if you hire foreign workers. And the universities love it, of course, because the foreign students pay a lot more in tuition than domestic students. The companies love it because these are controllable, malleable, right, programmable programmers, so to speak. And it's just really, really bad for everyone else. And so the tech companies are highly dependent on state power. This is not even to mention things like IP and all that kind of stuff. And but no, they get a lot of indirect subsidies through immigration programs, visa programs, H-1B programs, and the highly subsidized hiring of foreign college students, of people who are foreigners who've graduated from American universities. They get an automatic year-long visa to work, and then it can be extended. And because if you get fired from that job, I think you have to leave the country. They have a way unfair advantage as employers, so they can bully and boss these people around and so on. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. And you want to read Michelle Malkin's book. I interviewed the co-author on this. Michelle, just do a search for Michelle Malkin, H-1B visas or other things like that. Crap Weasels is in the title, so you should check that out. But no, it is a lot. And of course, a lot of these companies sell a huge amount of stuff to the government. I know that myself. So it's kind of tough for them to be anti-statist, even if they're not doing anything as direct as the Sherman Antitrust Act. It is, it's hard to be a conservative in America. And sometimes it's dangerous to be. The number of people I've talked to who've said, oh man, I can't wear a Make America Great Again hat anywhere around. I mean, I'll get the crap kicked out of me. I mean, it's physically dangerous. And, they want to be popular. They want to be liked. And they want good write-ups in the mainstream media. And they want good relationships with their investors and so on. And so, yeah, they want to be nicey, goopy stuff. But of course, it's become very stale. Paul Joseph Watson, conservatism is the new counterculture. It's really boring to be a leftist these days, and it's very much the mainstream, and it's very boring. So anyway, I'm going to move on to the next caller, but thanks for the call. I hope this was helpful and instructive in terms of debating this kind of stuff.
Well, it was definitely informative. There's a lot of things even I didn't know. I knew what they were saying was a lie, and I didn't really have a way to explain how it was a lie. So yeah, it's very, very informative.
Well, you can also just ask people, have you read any arguments counter to what you're telling me? I mean, this is you can ask this of your dad. Okay, so you've heard about these robber barons. I'm curious, have you ever read anything that counters that argument? And if they say no, then they really have no right to debate, because it's all propaganda. Listen, I have absorbed so much leftist material in my life. It's ridiculous. I mean, I do some of it for the show, of course, but I mean, just the way I was raised. And I mean, I went to undergraduate in 2 different universities and then graduate school in a 3rd university. And I was in theater school. I mean, I've had 12 lifetimes full of leftist crap. So I get the leftist arguments. I understand them. I've absorbed them. I know where they're coming from. And so, when I read non-leftist sources, I'm balancing with a lot of leftist stuff. But there's a lot of people. I mean, I bet if your dad, if you were to ask him, okay, what have you read that's counter to this perspective? What is the countervailing argument? It's the same thing. Oh, that's McCarthyism. It's like, oh, so you think McCarthyism was just some crazy witch hunt and he was insane. Have you ever read anything counter to that perspective? Well, no. It's like, well, then you don't, you're just a single Oasis consumer, which means you don't have any right to have an opinion because you don't even know it's an opinion. You think it's a fact because you've avoided all contrary sources. And
right. Of course, the funny thing about my dad is that he's generally pretty conservative about most things. He's just not as libertarian as I am. In fact, of the people in my family, I'm probably the most libertarian of the lot.
Well, keep working on him. We need all the small government people we can get a hold of. And, again, if you say to your dad, so did you learn this in a government school, that the government is really necessary for the functioning of your freedoms in the marketplace? And
yeah.
You don't think there may be a conflict of interest there? Anyway. All right. Well, thanks for the call, man. I'm sorry I got to move on to the next caller, but thanks very much for your time.
All right. Thank you.
All right, up next we have Zach. Zach wrote in and said, I dislike children. I often don't like being in the same room as children as they genuinely annoy me.